Now to our lead story. Has India royally snubbed the Maldives in its hour of crisis? India was the first stop for a planned visit by a special envoy of the Maldivian president. But New Delhi is believed to have said, not now. According to Maldivian authorities, the dates for the visit were not suitable for the Indian leadership. After all, Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj is visiting Saudi Arabia and Iran, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be setting out on a 4-day tour of UAE, Oman and Palestine tomorrow. The Maldives ambassador claims that they had even inquired if their foreign minister could meet a minister of state for foreign affairs in New Delhi. But India's answer remained, it's not possible right now. So instead, Maldives' embattled president Yamin has sent envoys to what he calls friendly nations, such as China, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, to brief them on the political crisis in the country. Yamin sent his economic development minister to China, the foreign minister to Pakistan and the farming and fisheries minister to Saudi Arabia. The Maldives is the only neighbor which Prime Minister Narendra Modi has not visited in his nearly 4 years in power. In the last week, since the Maldives crisis erupted, the face of the country's opposition, former President Mohammad Nasheed, has consistently called on India to intervene, whether militarily or diplomatically. India says it is monitoring the situation in the Maldives closely and has expressed concern and joined Britain, the US and the United Nations in calling for lifting of the emergency. But beyond that, New Delhi has not shown any overt interest, at least, in intervening in the Maldives. India's arch-rival China has already warned against any outside intervention. India's ties with the Maldives so far have been an attempt to push back China's expanding presence in the country. China, which did not even have an embassy in the Maldives until 2011, has lately emerged as a key player in the domestic politics of the tiny island nation. Beijing, in fact, is ramping up trade and diplomatic links, much to India's annoyance. Meanwhile, later tonight, the United Nations Security Council will discuss the crisis in the Maldives. During a closed-door meeting, the Council will hear a report by the UN Political Affairs Department, which asked the top UN body to take up the matter. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has already urged the Yamin government to lift the state of emergency imposed earlier this week. The Maldives has been in turmoil since the 1st of February when the Supreme Court ordered the release of political prisoners. Yamin's government defied that order and instead on the 5th of February declared a 15-day state of emergency. Security forces stormed into the court premises and arrested 2 judges, including the Chief Justice of the country. The police also arrested former President Maumoon Abdul Gayoom. The following day, an under-pressure Supreme Court revoked its order to free the political prisoners, quote-unquote, in light of the concerns raised by the president. So what is going on? Let's speak to Ahmed Mohammed, the ambassador to India from the Maldives. Good evening, Ambassador. My first question to you. Reports say that the Maldives has sent special envoys to Pakistan, China and Saudi Arabia, but not to India. How does Mali respond to that?
That news that Maldives envoys are en route to Pakistan, China and Saudi Arabia is true, and we also made a similar request to India, and in fact based on our declared policy, India first, we made that request to India for the special envoy to visit India first, and the envoy was, the special envoy of the President was the Minister of Foreign Affairs himself, and was going to be accompanied by the Minister for Legal Affairs, the Bilateral Secretary and the Director at the South Asia Division of the Foreign Ministry. That request was made yesterday, but we have been told that the timing was not suitable for the Indian leadership to meet the special envoy. And we understand that the External Affairs Minister is away. We also understand that the Prime Minister will be travelling overseas on an official visit soon. While knowing these facts, the request was even at an appropriate level with the External Affairs Ministry's state ministers. It would be appreciated if that meeting could have been arranged.
So you made repeated requests. Do you see this as a snub from India?
I don't see it as a snub. I see it as a matter of scheduling the meeting. India wanted at its highest level to have the meeting, but the story that the Maldives has omitted India in the list of envoys is not true. These meetings should happen on mutual convenience, and the clarification I am making to the media is that there was a request by the Maldives government to send a special envoy, and it was a high-powered delegation.
So what do you hope to achieve, Ambassador, by sending these special envoys to Pakistan, China and Saudi Arabia?
There have been concerns raised by the international community, including bilateral partners. The special envoys were supposed to be briefing the relevant governments on what is happening in Maldives. And I think engagement, discussions around the table is the best way to understand the situation in Maldives.
I assume would also be engagement with the opposition at home. The emergency, though, has been in place in the Maldives for the past few days. What's the situation on the ground? What's life like in Malé, for instance?
Well, on the first question, how is life in Maldives? Life in Maldives is continuing as normal. People's movement has not been restricted. The businesses are continuing as usual. Schools are open. Transportation systems are running. International airports are open. There is no curfew. And the state of emergency itself doesn't hinder any movement within the country.
And the opposition, meanwhile, has been urging India to intervene militarily. How does President Yamin see this? Has there been a comment from the government on this?
I don't know whether it is a comment from the government, but I personally would say that it is quite foolish for anyone to call for military intervention from a third country. The situation is such, as I have just explained, is normal daily life is going on. There is no civil war. There is people are not suffering. The businesses are ongoing, and well, none of the expatriate workers, none of the tourists' life is in danger. There is normality in Maldives. So the call is just foolish, I would say, foolish.
It's interesting that you repeatedly use the word normal. Any emergency, as I understand it, is anything but normal. Top judges are behind bars. The media has reportedly been gagged. The army blocked the parliament building. The United Nations Security Council is debating this crisis, is going to take it up this evening. World leaders have urged the president to follow court orders. Would you describe all of this as normal?
All of that, if that is true, is not normal. But what I am saying is the state of the Maldives should deal with issues that any power, any independent powers, whether it is the judiciary, whether it is the parliament, or whether it is the government, who tries to go beyond the rules and regulations of the country. No one should be above the rule of law. Everyone should remain within the limitations and within the boundary of rule of law. So it is an internal matter. It is an internal matter, and we have the capacity to deal with our internal matters.
And my final question, Ambassador, what role, if any, does your government want India to play?
The first role of any country to play is to reach out. Therefore, we initiated the reach out to friendly countries, and India was the first to reach out. Let's sit down, let's talk about it, and let's understand it better.
Ambassador Ahmed Mohammed, thanks very much for joining us and sharing with us your side of the story. This remains a developing story. After President Abdullah Yamin took over from Mohammed Nasheed in the Maldives, he made new friends, and these are the friends that he's now reaching out to. Let's understand why he picked China, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia as destinations for his special envoys. Yamin's proximity with Beijing is an open secret. He has steadily taken his country closer to China. He was the first Asian head of state to visit China after the Communist Party conference in October last year. Former President Nasheed says that the Maldives is steadily falling into the Chinese debt trap, and he claims that more than 70% of the country's foreign debt is now with China. But President Yamin has taken personal initiative in deepening ties with China. Both countries signed 12 agreements last year. One of those is a free trade pact. China and the Maldives have also agreed to increase their cooperation for the Belt and Road Initiative. President Yamin also ensured that the Maldives maintains its relationship with China's all-weather ally Pakistan. During his visit to Islamabad in 2015, President Yamin said that Pakistan has proved that it is a sincere friend of his country. The two countries have enjoyed bilateral ties for nearly half a century as members of the SAARC. Both sides have signed a number of MOUs, that's Memoranda of Understanding in Trade, Tourism and Higher Education. In 1996, Pakistan had built the Parliament building in Malé as a gift to the country. Given its 100% Sunni population, the Maldives has moved closer to Saudi Arabia in recent years as well. Soon after President Yamin took charge in 2014, Saudi Arabia promised to invest in building 10 world-class mosques in the Maldives. In 2014, the Saudi king booked 3 Maldivian islands for nearly a month, which is one example of the growing role of Saudi investment in that country. And in 2016, Riyadh pledged a $150 million bailout loan to the Maldives to make payments on loans taken out for infrastructure scale-up in the country. Next year, the Yamin government decided to give control of an entire atoll to Saudi Arabia. Now, the Maldives' totalitarian President Abdullah Yamin has also forced judges of the Supreme Court, the opposition says at gunpoint, to reverse an order which would have seen the opposition return to power and himself ousted. The opposition and the Supreme Court have fervently appealed to India. India has its troops on standby but is unlikely to send them into the island nation. The question is why? What are the pros and cons of Indian army intervention in the Maldives? Let's take a closer look at the situation. The courts and parliament have been shut down by the army. Demonstrations, in fact, are subdued because they face armed troops, and opposition politicians have been arrested. The Indian army will not intervene for several reasons. One of them is because the situation is essentially a domestic crisis. Second, this is not an act of terrorism, no matter how brazen. And finally, there has been fortunately no bloodshed. If there is, it may change, but for now, the Indian army will stay in a state of preparedness in southern India. Now, they all benefit from India in one way or another. Their citizens frequently cite Indian conditions to better those in their own countries, and yet, be it Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, Nepal or even the Maldives, India bashing remains the #1 pastime of all of India's neighbouring countries. Any Indian boots on the ground in the Maldives would worsen India's reputation in the entire region, and that's another reason why Indian army boots will stay put in India for now. The closeness between Mr. Yamin and Beijing could well be described in a slogan that indicated brotherhood between China and India back in the 60s. China has managed to tighten its control over the island nation through its usual brand of debt trap diplomacy as an important hub of its Belt and Road Initiative. More Chinese tourists visit the Maldives every year than the entire population of the island nation, whose primary source of income is tourism. An Indian army intervention in the Maldives then could set off a multilateral conflagration which could go out of control. But India has the edge over China in 2 other ways, neither of which the Chinese can do much about. Maldivians and Indians share cultural commonalities, as does all of South Asia. The Maldives is part of the same ancient volcanic chain as India's Lakshadweep Islands. Indeed, there is only one other part of the world where Dhivehi, the language of the Maldives, is spoken to. It is the Minicoy Island in the southernmost atoll of India's Lakshadweep. And another aspect that China will never be able to change is India's closeness and ability to respond in a crisis in the Maldives, which has won New Delhi much goodwill in the past. From its southernmost tip, India is merely 700 kilometers away from the Maldives. So for the moment, it is going to be wait and watch for India, and watch very closely, as New Delhi has been saying. Amidst this crisis, it appears that the opposition in Malé is also a divided lot. On Wednesday, exiled former Maldivian President Mohammad Nasheed asked India to play the role of quote-unquote liberators and intervene militarily to resolve the ongoing political turmoil in the country. He tweeted, and I'm going to quote, saying resolve things internally is akin to asking us to escalate the revolt, which can lead to chaos. Maldivians see India's role positively. In '88, they came, resolved the crisis and left. They were not occupiers, but liberators, and this is why Maldivians look to India now. Nasheed had also asked the Indian government to send an envoy backed by its military to free the judges and the political detainees. In 1988, remember, then President of Maldives, Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, had sought India's help to defeat a coup by mercenaries. But today, even as Gayoom is behind bars, his own daughter, Dunya, believes that Nasheed's call for India's intervention is very irresponsible. Speaking to an Indian daily, Dunya Maumoon said, and I'm quoting, "I believe that the call by Nasheed for foreign intervention is very irresponsible, even by certain countries. Yes, we are having a crisis, and there are a lot of issues we need to resolve, and I have been continuously calling for peaceful dialogue and enough of war. We have seen a lot of destructive actions, and our people are very concerned. As a country, we really need to make the decisions ourselves and find a way by ourselves." That's not all. Dunya has supported the Maldivian president's move of declaring an emergency, effectively going against her own father, who is President Abdullah Yamin's half-brother. Yamin ordered the arrest of Maumoon Abdul Gayoom hours after declaring a state of emergency earlier this week. The split in the opposition makes it harder for Delhi to find a middle path to this crisis. The Indian government has already issued 2 statements criticizing the political chaos in the Maldives and that it was especially, quote-unquote, disturbed by the imposition of emergency. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is on a record-breaking spree. He made history last year when he became the first Indian Premier to visit Israel. And this week, he'll make history again by becoming the first Indian head of government to visit Palestine. Ramesh Ramachandran in Delhi and Daniele Pagani in Jerusalem set the stage for the Prime Minister's 4-day, 3-nation West Asia tour.
Since coming to power in 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has set a scorching pace, travelling to most countries of consequence in West Asia. He has visited Saudi Arabia, which conferred its highest civilian honour, the King Abdulaziz sash, on him. He went to Iran, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. He has also hosted leaders from the region, such as Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. So what explains the flurry of visits? Well, for one, India sees West Asia as its extended neighbourhood, which has a direct bearing on its security and economic interests. India has the unique distinction of having good ties with all countries in the region. It buys almost all its oil from the region. More than 8 million Indians live and work in the region, and the region is the biggest source of foreign remittances. In the next few days, Prime Minister Modi will visit Palestine, the UAE and Oman. And going forward, he is expected to host leaders from Jordan, Iran and Saudi Arabia. In Palestine, he will hold talks with President Mahmoud Abbas at Ramallah. Modi will reach Ramallah from Amman in neighbouring Jordan without having to set foot on Israeli territory.
Of late, India says it has de-hyphenated its relations with Israel and Palestine, suggesting that it intends to treat them as 2 separate and independent entities, exactly as India is already doing in West Asia with the Sunni, Saudi Arabia, and the Shia, Iran.
In the UAE, Prime Minister Modi will address the World Government Summit and participate in the groundbreaking ceremony of a Hindu temple in Abu Dhabi. On the 3rd and final leg of his visit, he will travel to Oman. As is now the practice with most Modi visits abroad, the Indian Prime Minister will address the Indian diaspora in Dubai and Muscat. Bureau Report, WION.
Closer home, some important developments. A court verdict shook Bangladesh today. There was arson, protests, political implications are far-reaching, and India is keeping a close watch.
Former Prime Minister and chairperson of Bangladesh Nationalist Party, Khaleda Zia, will have to go to jail for 5 years. 5 others, including her son Tariq Rahman, have been pronounced 10 years jail terms in the same case. This will put Zia's party, effectively the largest opposition, in deep crisis as she'd be barred to participate in the next national elections. This is, however, a lower court and she would be entitled to appeal at a higher court challenging the verdict.
She has been convicted to jail in this case because of grabbing the wealth of the orphans. The court has jailed her to 5 years of rigorous imprisonment.
We think Khalida Zia is innocent. She has given us the decision to file an appeal. We have applied today. We have applied for a certified copy. If we receive the certified copy today, we will appeal on Sunday, God willing.
But even before Khalida Zia's party challenges the verdict, the Bangladesh government has stated it had no role to play in the judgment.
I said that this case was started by the caretaker government at that time.
Okay.
And you must remember that the caretaker government was at that time supported by the army chief, who was handpicked by Khalida Zia.
Okay.
It was at that time that the case was lodged.
6 persons, including former Prime Minister Khalida Zia and her son Tariq Rahman, have been charged with embezzling more than 20 million Bangladeshi takas from the charity funds of Zia Orphanage Trust. A tight security prevails across Dhaka city and outside the capital. Paramilitary forces, Rapid Action Battalion and Border Guard Bangladesh have been deployed along with the police to foil any agitation across the country. Just on my left, there's a prison van where you can see people being picked up by the police and put inside this prison van. This has been going on across the capital, and this is the reflection of the preemptive actions that the police have been taking. And most of these people, they say, are picketers or activists of the opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party.
It's not an ordinary judgment. Its implications will have a lasting effect on Bangladesh's politics. First and foremost, Khalida Zia's party, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, now faces a leadership crisis. Unless Khalida Zia's conviction is overturned, chances are her party will find it difficult to challenge the ruling Awami League. Clearly, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's party gets electoral advantage. However, the credibility of upcoming elections could also come under scrutiny in the absence of opposition leadership. And lastly, there could be nationwide protests, keeping security personnel and the government on their toes. Indo-Bangla relations have seen an upturn in recent years. India will be closely watching as the political situation in Dhaka unfolds. Bureau Report, WION.
American forces have launched rare airstrikes in eastern Syria against pro-government forces after their base in Deir ez-Zor was attacked. All this comes at a time when more than 100 civilians have died in the last 48 hours in Syria. Here's a report.
Once again, planes bombed parts of eastern Ghouta. Amid the smoke, rubble and damaged buildings, members of the White Helmets were scrambling to help injured civilians on the ground. The ongoing airstrikes have killed dozens of civilians in recent days. Civilians in eastern Ghouta are trapped by the airstrikes as Russian and Syrian forces continue with their intense offensive to drive out insurgents. Clearly, the war is far from over. While the Islamic State may have lost the battle, the differences between the Americans and the Russians over Syria is now spilling onto the battleground. This is not the first time pro-Assad forces, backed by the Russians, have clashed with the US military. As the war in Syria draws to a close, both the United States and Russia are competing with each other to have a greater say in the peace deal. But this has sparked concerns of a direct conflict between the United States and Russia. But the ongoing conflict is taking its toll on the civilians. Airstrikes in the last 48 hours have killed more than 100 people, while dozens of civilians still remain missing. Bureau Report, WION.
The dreaded terror outfit ISIS seems to be making a comeback, and it's not some obscurantist and fundamentalist organizations who are aiding and abetting the regeneration of the ISIS, but rather the very nations who fought for 3 years, some of the most fierce battles in the deserts of Syria and Iraq, who are now recruiting the ISIS fighters. According to reports, the Turkish army, which launched an offensive along its southern border with Syria in an operation called Operation Olive Branch, is recruiting, training and rearming former ISIS fighters to fight their battles. When Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced Operation Olive Branch, he'd insisted that the military offensive in the Kurdish-dominated region of Afrin was to keep its borders safe. This operation is a fight against the Kurdish YPG forces and the SDF, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, who had been close allies of the US in defeating the ISIS in eastern parts of Syria. Erdogan's objective is to quell any Kurdish nationalistic movement along its southern and eastern border with Syria and Iraq. A former ISIS fighter who has now been enlisted in the Turkish army to fight against the YPG said, and I'm quoting, "How we were steadfast in Grozny, in Chechnya, and Dagestan in North Caucasus, and we took Tora Bora, the former headquarters of Osama bin Laden, and now Afrin is calling to us." This incident has, of course, thrown up some serious questions on whether the nations which fought against the ISIS are serious about bringing those militants to justice or are willing to assimilate them into their armed forces just because it suits them. And it's not just Turkey under Erdogan which is actively aiding the continuance of the ISIS. In fact, every nation with a stake in this region has negotiated and aided the world's most ruthless Islamist terror group. And each side involved in Syria is blaming the other for its revival. Senior Foreign Affairs Editor Padma Rao has more.
Syria's ally, Russia, has just patted itself on the back in public for ridding Syria of the Islamic State. Some months ago, the United States had also claimed its victory over the ISIS. But reports have emerged that the Islamic State is well and alive and has regrouped right under the noses and with the knowledge of all parties involved in the Syrian conflict. The year 2017 ended on a high for all the countries which claim to be fighting the terror group. The mission to defeat the Islamic State in Syria carried out by the armed forces of the Russian Federation has been accomplished. This is what General Sergei Rutskoy of Russia said. "We defeated Daesh, that's the ISIS. Long live Iraq and its people." That's what the Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi of Iraq said. "I want to thank Mattis for doing such a great job. He's knocked the hell out of ISIS." That was President Donald Trump of the United States. Late last year, Syrian troops advanced against ISIS in eastern Syria near the ISIS stronghold Deir az-Zor. Many expected a fierce and bloody battle. Oddly, the Islamic State fell rather tamely and Syrian troops occupied Deir az-Zor. But shortly thereafter, ISIS sprung back into life again, this time 270 kilometers west of Deir az-Zor, on the border between territories held by the Syrian government troops on the one hand and anti-government rebels on the other. And there they began a fresh offensive. Syria is backed by Russia and Iran. The United States is backed by the Western coalition and on the ground by Syrian Kurds. They have all waged bitter and bloody wars against the world's most ruthless Islamist terror outfit. So how on earth did this regrouping happen? There are several theories coursing through the global media. A UK-based strategist told Germany's Bild Daily that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was to blame. He said that ISIS, Russia and Mr. Assad often worked, quote-unquote, hand in hand. It goes like this. The Russian-Syria coalition bombs anti-government rebels while the ISIS attacks those rebels. In return, the ISIS launches attacks on rebels to allow government troops to advance. Southeast Asian ISIS fighters too are said to be back with their terror group in Deir az-Zor, but may have also joined the thousands of ISIS terrorists said to be hiding out in Turkey, according to one Malaysian publication. There may be a grain of truth to the allegations. In fall 2017, Syria had struck a surrender deal and allowed 300 ISIS terrorists and families to leave the Syria-Lebanon border for Deir az-Zor. US-led forces had bombed the 17 buses carrying the terrorists, and the convoy finally left after splitting in two directions. But where did those two buses go? Russia has struck back. In a recent interview, the chief of Russia's general staff, General Gerasimov, blamed the United States for reviving the Islamic State in Syria to create yet another anti-Assad fighting force. According to General Gerasimov, TANF, the US military base in Syria on the border to Iraq, is being used by the United States to train former ISIS militants as the new Syrian army, quote-unquote, to destabilize Syria. There are many grains of verity in that claim too. Just months after Damascus obliged by providing those buses for the terrorists to leave, so also did the US-led coalition. They too struck a deal with the ISIS, one they use a euphemism to describe, quote-unquote, civilian evacuation. The clouds of war had seemed to have lifted from the troubled region just months ago. But it is not only Turkey's ongoing offensive against Kurds in Syria that is threatening to destabilize Syria again. When it comes to creating a situation on the ground which will give all the big powers with geostrategic stakes in the region an excuse to stay on indefinitely, there are plenty who seem willing, even if it means sleeping with the enemy. Padma Rao, WION.
It's rare that North Korea does something that escapes the public eye. A day before the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in South Korea, Pyongyang held a military parade. What's the message that Kim Jong-un is trying to send?
About 13,000 goose-stepping troops, 50,000 spectators, tanks, artillery and all the other military bells and whistles. That's North Korea for you on the eve of its participation in the Winter Olympics in South Korea. But unlike previous occasions, this parade was not telecast live on state-run television, and foreign media were banned from the event. So what message was North Korea's supreme leader Kim Jong-un trying to send? The Western media speculated that since declaring itself a nuclear state last year, the North is trying to normalize its status. The parade on Thursday and the Olympic event the next day is to underscore that. More than anything else, it tells the world the North will not compromise on its nuclear weapons, seen as the ultimate guarantee of regime survival. Coinciding with these events was satellite images posted by Beyond Parallel, a website providing analysis and research reports about the Korean peninsula. It says Pyongyang is building 2 new military bases on its southwest coast. One base at Yongbong-ni is just 30 minutes from the South Korean island of Daecheong-do, and from there to the port of Incheon. It will deploy at least 50 assault hovercraft. Another base in Sasulpo will also have assault hovercraft. Construction work is visible. It will enable the North to attack the South from the south and the east, rather than the heavily defended land border. Incheon had been captured by the North Koreans during the early phase of the Korean War in the 1950s. So the presence of North Korean assault hovercraft will renew concerns in the south. Although nobody expects a war to break out, the south is comfortably aware that the North can marshal nearly 1 million men and thousands of tanks and artillery in the event of war. Bureau Report, WION.
And this is just a day before the Olympics. The Olympics, incidentally, are not political, yet the build-up to the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang have been anything but apolitical. 2 countries, North Korea and Russia, are the topic of debate and discussion worldwide and will continue to be so, with the eligibility of 15 Russian athletes and coaches set to be decided on the day of the opening ceremony on Friday. Sports editor Divijay Singh there with the political quagmire surrounding the Pyeongchang Games.
International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach signing the truce mural at the Athletes' Village in Pyeongchang a few days back. An Olympic truce dates back to ancient times, but the IOC is at war even as the countdown begins for the opening ceremony.
Given the special circumstances, the time and place of these Olympic Winter Games, it should be clear for everyone why this Olympic truce is as relevant today as it was in ancient times.
Peace and friendship are important words, especially with North Korea agreeing to participate at Pyeongchang at the last minute. It has caused an administrative headache, but the pros firmly outweigh the cons. The 2 Koreas, North and South, divided by decades of animosity, will march together at the opening ceremony. There is even a unified ice hockey team that will compete at the Games. But the politics isn't far away. US Vice President Mike Pence will be at the Games alongside the sister of North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un and North Korea's nominal head of state, Kim Jong-nam.
These initiatives gives all parties the chance to reflect on what the future could look like if we were all guided by this Olympic spirit. But Korea's journey does not end here. The political tensions will not disappear overnight.
Political symbolism, though, can't be wished away. The IOC finds itself in a quagmire over the presence of Russian athletes at the Games. The IOC banned Russia for state-sponsored doping at the last Olympics in Sochi, but allowed 168 Russian athletes to participate as neutrals. Their delayed response against state-sponsored doping in Russia was made a mockery of by the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which overturned the life ban on 28 Russian athletes to worldwide condemnation.
But I still don't think that the rest of us clean athletes should have to pay for that. We shouldn't be penalized and be racing and competing against someone who does have all this evidence against them. So I was shocked when the appeal went through, and I'm very disappointed that the people making these decisions came to the conclusions they did.
The IOC has stood firm by not allowing any of the feared athletes an entry for the Games. 15 of those athletes have filed an appeal with CAS, joining 32 others who have appealed their exclusion. The IOC says the CAS judgment is flawed, but the Russians are going for the jugular.
There are other courts. CAS itself can now make a decision about the sportsmen and women whose bans were overturned by CAS and who were not invited to the Olympic Games by IOC. After all, IOC is not a private enterprise. I was under the impression 4 years ago that it is a prominent sport organization, but now I have serious doubts about it.
CAS has announced that they will rule on the appeals on Friday, hours before the opening ceremony. With the IOC already adopting an extreme position, any decision in favor of the Russian participation will leave the IOC with egg on its face. The stakes are just too high for them. Digvijay Singhdeo, WION.